vamos a hablar de los tres grandes retos que tenemos ahora mismo, que son intermediarios de datos, interoperabilidad, esa palabra mágica, y gobernanza, que ya sabes, Mélida, el conector ha muerto, viva la gobernanza. O sea, ahora todo el mundo se preocupa por la gobernanza en lugar de por el conector. Entonces, ¿quién mejor para moderar esta primera sesión de retos? Te he puesto lo más difícil, Chechu. ¿Quién es mejor que Chechu Santa María, que es nuestro responsable del grupo de trabajo de tecnología? Muchas gracias, Chechu.
Gracias, Paqui. Bueno, como siempre es un placer juntarnos en un evento de este tipo y compartir entre todos conocimiento. Como decía Paqui, ahora venimos del café, pasamos a una sesión un poco diferente. Vamos a contar con una serie de presentaciones que nos van a hablar de esos retos que comentaba Paqui. En este primer grupo, dos retos o dos aspectos fundamentales de la economía del dato: los intermediarios de datos y en la segunda parte de interoperabilidad. Intermediarios de datos, esos que podemos llamar eslabones de la cadena que ayudan a montar la economía del dato, los espacios de datos, la compartición de datos. En ambos slots hemos querido dividirlos en dos partes. Una primera parte más teórica, más hablar de fundamentos, y luego acompañarla siempre de un caso práctico en ambas de ellas. La interoperabilidad lo veremos luego. Interoperabilidad, bueno, es un must. Hablábamos antes de la fragmentación. La interoperabilidad tiene mucho que ver con la fragmentación. Interoperabilidad, eso que debe permitir que cuando alguien se conecta a un espacio de datos, con independencia de cuál sea la tecnología que utilice, sea capaz de poder conectarse con el otro, poder intercambiar los datos con el otro, poder acceder a los datos del otro, pero no solo eso, que cuando compartamos los datos diferentes puedan unirse, compararse, utilizarse de forma común, o incluso aspectos relacionados con, digamos, más la gobernanza que comentaba Paqui, o los temas contractuales, la parte más del modelo de negocio. Para esta primera parte de intermediarios de datos contamos con dos presentaciones. La primera, centrada en los ámbitos de fundamentos y marco regulatorio. Tenemos a Malte Beyer-Katzenberger de la Comisión Europea, de la unidad G1. Calte, the floor is yours.
Now we go back to English. I'm just testing the sound. I say thank you, Paqui, for that signal. That's very useful. And I will probably share the slides from my screen. That's also very useful. It's a subject that fascinates me because it goes back to many years of AI strategies. We're still in the AI strategies, what we can do to build these large data pools. At some point, and I think the company that Didier will speak on behalf of was also part of the investigation on our side to say, do we need a new type of intermediary in the economy? Like we have it for the financial system, we have lots of financial intermediaries that make the money flow. Will we need specialized intermediaries to make the data flow? And now you can have, and now this sits, I think, well in the context of the data spaces, and I will say also how I see the relationship between services and data spaces, and by no means we have all the answers, by no means the future is now. It's all in development, and we always observe, and I would love actually to be with you to also listen a bit more what's going on in terms of data space getting real, what they facilitate, what type of roles you need in a data space. And from the Commission side, we're trying to support this in many fronts, and I will speak about this. One thing certainly is that we had tried very early, actually, we started this reflection in 2020 with the last Commission mandate, the last strategy on data from February 2020, and we conceptualize intermediaries as this novel element that might quickly take off, that might quickly become very prominent in data spaces. And I can already get you the conclusion, it didn't take off as quickly as we thought. And that's also why I will fast forward from the proposal which was made at the end of 2020 to a new proposal that was made at the end of 25, which is the so-called digital omnibus or simplification omnibus. But in the so-called Data Governance Act, we had made an attempt to regulate basically a novel type of neutral, trustworthy data intermediation service, which has as a business function and as a business expectation to really focus on facilitating the transaction for others. This is, so to say, also the lesson learned from platformization trends in the digital economy, where you have the mega platforms that say, well, we integrate everything, virtually integrated, but certainly also a lot of data accumulation, which now with acts like the Digital Markets Act, we're trying to unravel or to roll back a little bit for certain very large platforms, the so-called gatekeepers. So the discussion on the Digital Markets Act, Data Governance Act were a bit in parallel, and inside this department of the European Commission, we had lots of discussions. What's the best for the future of data economy? Are platforms necessarily a bad thing? And what we were saying with the Data Governance Act, we allow at least those who say, I will only help others to monetize, to pool, to share their data, to stay strictly within these limits, and I will not speculate as an intermediary on the value of these data. I will not be allowed to do anything else with these data. And also, finally, I should be very neutral as a marketplace. I should really be the marketplace, and I should not participate on my own marketplace. So we had a rather strict regime to say, if you claim to help others to share, monetize, pool their data, and that's your business technical proposition, you need to notify this to a competent authority. In Spain, it's a subdirectorate, I think, of the Ministry for Digital. And then you will also obtain as a plus a label, but certainly also you have to register yourself and you have to submit yourself then to certain categories. Otherwise, you cannot be active on the market anymore. It's a compulsory regime, really. I want to also say this. We have some archetypes defined. If you go to the legal act, and there's a clickable link under the words Data Governance Act, you will find also some descriptives what we thought at that time. And then also in Article 10, you find also the notion of data cooperatives and things like that. I will come in a second where also you can find some inspiration whether you are actually, are you concerned in a data space context? Are you not concerned? I will come back to that, because also to my dismay, sometimes the things are not too much joined up. However, because we also heard, well, things didn't go so fast, there was not the big risk that data intermediaries will become the new type of platform. It didn't really materialize, maybe also as a result of the Data Governance Act. We don't really know. I mean, we have a study, but the study was not able to get to any evidence in either direction, so rather inconclusive. But what we certainly heard is that this is too much of a nascent market. Even in the data spaces, we cannot exactly say which services are covered or not. We have very few companies who commercially are active in this space at a relevant economic scale. I would say we have, at the moment, I think 28 notified intermediaries, but many are very niche, very small, very local. So it's not the biggest market competition problem that we observed. On the other hand, we had a very strict rule to say, if you are an intermediary, you have to set up a separate legal company. You cannot do anything with the data. And that also made the offering for any customer of that service relatively uninteresting, because, I mean, you basically pay for something that is more like a credit card function, so it's monetary transaction. But that's useful in our financial economy for sure, and we are used to this. But at the stage of the data sharing economy, this is not yet a very self-standing function. So it's more interesting if you say, I can also offer some added value data services out of a same customer bundle, and I can present several services, one of which is intermediation. I can present these two at the same time as a data analytics service from the same platform, because then people will come to my service and I can actually make something offering. So with the so-called digital simplification omnibus proposal, which came out on the 19th of November. We are actually already proposing to modify the Data Governance Act regime and make it softer, certainly on this legal separation rule. And we will also make it a voluntary regime. That's very important. So you can actually stand out, especially maybe in a data space context. We now hear that it can become interesting if you are one of the so-called operational services of a data space, that you may say, okay, well, I will, you all should trust me in this data space ecosystem because I'm labeled according to this European label, and I will still not do, when I'm called to intermediate between you and make the sharing possible or make discovery of available data from certain participants in the data space possible, I will not use any information that I find out as a result of my rather central function for anything else than to support the well-functioning of the data space. I think so far so reasonable, I think, for everyone. But we want obviously to say there could be always attempts or commercial attempts to also go beyond and not respect the data sovereignty, which should remain with all the participating entities of the data space. Also, the Data Governance Act as an instrument disappears. It will be going into an existing other piece of legislation called the Data Act, but that's maybe more for the lawyers in the room. And that is at the stage of a proposal, which is now currently discussed with the Council of Ministers, where Spain is represented, and the members of the European Parliament, and we are really seeing merely the appointment of the relevant committees in the European Parliament. But as it's meant to be a simplification proposal and doesn't have, apart from this change, a lot of other things that are complicated, we also believe that the negotiations should be rather going fast. So also, whatever feedback you have, make it either on the dedicated have your say page of the Commission, and I will add this actually to this slide before you get it, by the 28th of January. And that's feedback for the Commission, but also certainly communicate that to anyone you know in the ministries, so that Spain or wherever you are based can also feed this into the legislative discussion. The Commission at this stage cannot modify its own proposal, but it can obviously accept modifications coming from Council and Parliament, and it will be part of a so-called trilateral negotiation to say, okay, what makes sense, what is acceptable, without that the proposal of the Commission is disfigured, is completely no longer recognizable. Now, I spoke already about data intermediaries in the context of the data spaces. Our key means for us to observe what is happening in the Gaia-X ecosystem is the so-called Data Spaces Support Center that some of you know, and Clara, obviously, I was happy to see you, knows it extremely well, where we have, I think, made a very good attempt to align the conceptual visions and the architectural building bricks of data spaces among a variety of actors, notably the International Data Spaces Associations, FIWARE, second, and to come to a so-called blueprint, of which the version 2.0 is currently public, and behind that link is the intermediaries and operators building block, and blueprint 3.0 is currently in preparation, and I think it's due to come out in January or February next year. What I still think, and it's also a lack of investment on our side maybe, is that we have not really joined up well the notions that we observe in a data spaces. So what type of the federated services are really covered by the Data Governance Act and how we see the interplay. So it's a bit still also in the draft that I saw, a bit still disconnected. It was the same situation a bit of a year ago. And I think we made the comment at the time it could be more easily joined up to really examine from a Gaia-X perspective, from the roles perspective, to say, okay, what is a typical service and that would be regulated under the DGA currently as it is, because it's still in force, and we don't know what the new proposal will actually lead to. Maybe it's not going to stay the same as the Commission wanted it. But clearly, if I am in the operational situation and I have knowledge about what's going on in my data space, and there could be capture and lock-in, as the new version will describe it, there are certainly risks that if there are like key services that see a lot of things happening through which a lot of the data at least the meta information flows, whereas maybe the sharing is completely decentralized and I don't even need an intermediary. I at least have some risk in the data space that there could be trust problems in a data space that the Data Governance Act actually would like to have addressed through the intermediaries regulation. Maybe also to say, indeed, we understand that's maybe also where the problem comes from, and that the vision of IDSA was to say a data space will be decentralized and we will not rely on the intermediaries. So far, so good. I mean, we will see also forms of data pooling that we imagined in 2020 that they didn't come about so clearly. And this can also have to do with competition law, and I will get to how we actually try to address this in a second. To also make this maybe common knowledge that we have a new data strategy, this time called the Data Union Strategy. This builds on jargon we use for banking union, capital markets union. That is a bit of a slogan word that our political level likes to use. This succeeds the 2020 data strategy. It was adopted on 19th November, and you have the link behind this. There are 3 pillars. There's data for AI, there's regulatory simplification, and I see that the Spanish spell checker worked well for international dimension. On the data for AI part, this is really on investment still in infrastructures, and there's a lot to read there, but I invite you to read it because it's a very interesting document, 3-4 pages, if you haven't, on what we do still with data spaces. The key messages that I take away as someone who has also been in this discussion for a few years now is that we as Commission still think it's very relevant to organize the ecosystems around these data space notion, whereas also some people in our organization sometimes say, okay, well, when we see results, so people becoming also a bit impatient, what is a good example of a data space that actually saves companies money and where there is actually an economic interest to be a participant, and then to say, well, we could maybe focus also on our financial contributions on those data spaces that have a public interest value, that's health and energy and the transition to a greener economy. Now here, if I see the discussion as well, we are not really committing anything and indicating spending because we're having in parallel discussions also on always the 7-year financial cycle of the European Union, which means that we will see new funding programs. And at the moment, I'm not participating in this discussion, seeing enough to say how will these prioritization of funding actually materialize in terms of amounts, but also new work programs. So this still needs a bit of time for the new funding programs to be in place, and then the first biannual work programs to also announce the funding priorities. Many data spaces have actually support actions at the moment that are there to implement the frameworks, and that's also so it's just good to maybe also see these actions going on. The really new thing, and that's I think puzzles many of what this is and what it could be, and I maybe want to visualize this first with this little image here. It is the notion of a data lab. Now the data lab as a notion, don't read too much into the word. I probably would have chosen another word, but it is actually somewhere a connector function between the heavy financial investment into AI factories, where we tweak the supercomputing centers to be basically adapted for AI innovation, and the bit of a disconnected funding that we did on the data spaces. And maybe some of you recognize that we have typically used this kind of image, so the details of that image don't really matter, but this symbolizes our vertically funding into different data spaces. And now we're trying to say, well, okay, how we bridge actually between the two, and is there maybe an intermediate function? And the intermediate function, there's a lot to read. There's, I think, a full page of possible functions that this data lab function can have, where my understanding is that it's very dependent on actually what an individual consortium that wants to actually either attach it directly to their proposal for an AI factory, or independently one will actually propose to actually do. But if you really try to see a bit like the conceptual roots, you will find this in the so-called Draghi report, which is a big report on how Europe should be more competitive. And you find something which I suspect comes certainly from our DG on page 84, where the hope is that for a lot more use cases, we give also free advice in terms of compliance with the legal systems. That's building now the question, why don't we see the data pools, and will people be held back by the competition law? And here there is a clear negotiation with our central competition authority in the Commission to say you should be able to examine and validate upfront certain proposals for certain data lab functions or even data pooling instances. So we're making a little progress to give also the regulatory ex-ante guidance so that participants feel maybe a bit more comfortable. So it's been, and this has not been a very easy call, because the colleagues were rather resistant, saying, well, this is not our role, we cannot have a volume problem, we cannot help everyone with free legal advice, but we pushed them a little bit out of that comfort zone. And then you have the other functions, which are technical support in the data preparation, creation of synthetic data. There's a lot of things conceivable for such a data lab to do. Whether it materializes depends evidently on the funding, but this is maybe also for you to get to know this new concept and also help in the shaping. And I believe Big Data Values Association is in the room, and that's maybe also one of the ways to communicate with us as a team, because that's how we try to capture, next to the Data Spaces Support Center, the community industry feedback. With this, I think I wanted to close. Thank you for the attention. I hope I stayed within a good time limit, and passing it back to Clara.
Thank you very much, Mr. Malte, about this clarification about the landscape of the data intermediaries and the current status of this regulatory framework. Now we will go to the practical aspects, and we have here Mr. Didier Navet from DAWEX that will talk about a practical use case on data intermediaries. Didier, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me just... You see my screen? Yes. Great. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak about a practical experience that we have at DAWEX on the market in supporting the development and implementation and rollout of data spaces. The company, just a few words regarding the company. We are in the business for more than 10 years now. We celebrated 10 years of existence this year. And our own and only focus is about providing a technology solution to facilitate the sharing and exchange of data between various stakeholders. So that has been really our DNA since the beginning. And we've had quite a good recognition so far, with being awarded the title of Technology Pioneer by the World Economic Forum, invited at Davos to speak, and also at the G7 summits. We're also very active in Gaia-X, lead of the data exchange services working group. We operate and support organizations in more than 15 different sectors. And basically, we have one technology, but which is actually addressing many different use cases. So that we see organizations that have some needs for sharing, exchanging data internally between their own divisions, subsidiaries all around the world, and therefore the declination there of the technologies about and the implementation is targeted at corporate data hubs, we call them. But it can be also a data marketplace where basically it's managing an ecosystem where multiple data providers provide data to multiple data acquirers who find interest in getting access to those data to address their own use cases. And you also have industry data spaces where basically the ecosystem is targeted at one specific industry. Generally, you will have consortiums put in place, and the objective is to optimize operations, boost innovations, and so on through the sharing of data. So far, we've been working, and we are working with many organizations around the world, and also participating to a number of projects at the bottom of the slides. I'd like to mention maybe one example, which is the GCADX, for example, in the aerospace. It's all about the building of, and Airbus is the key players in that consortium, in that project. The challenge there is about reducing drastically the time to build an airplane. You have more than 10,000 suppliers. Some are very large corporations, some are SMEs, and you have up to 8 tiers in terms of connection between all these stakeholders. That makes a nightmare in terms of sharing and exchanging data, which is needed if you want to optimize and streamline the production and the construction of an airplane. And this is where typically you find this interest of having a control environment which provides also the security, which provides the compliance to regulations, which provides the interoperability, all these elements which are critical in order to reduce the time for building an airplane. So that's just one example of very practical situations where data sharing, data exchange, data space is essential, and the role also of data intermediaries. I'll speak about that in a minute. So just to briefly show a few references. When we're talking about data marketplace, for example, Afterize, that is the company Mobivia, who is a leader in retail, automotive, and aftermarket services with brands like Midas, Norauto, ATU. It's a European leader, 65 million customers, and they have put in place a marketplace in that case, where basically hundreds of companies are onboarded, for more than 350 at the moment, and they are exchanging and sharing and acquiring data. And this business, actually the business model behind, makes it that Afterize has been profitable business to 1 year of operation. So that's an important element I would also put in terms of the need for defining sustainable and business model for operation. If we talk about the corporate data hub, I could speak about in the media space, TF1 Group, which is the #1 French TV broadcaster, but also one of the leading European one, where in this case, they are using the similar technology, similar implementation for different purposes, for streamlining the sharing and exchange of data within the group in order to provide better services. Industry data space, Hub1 Data Trust, that's part of the ADP, Aéroports de Paris Group, which is the world leader in airport operations, operating, of course, the French airports, but also the various airports around the world. And they have also very in the airport ecosystem, it's a very complex ecosystem where you have many players, many stakeholders involved, and by optimizing the sharing and the exchange of data between them, they can actually provide eventually better services to the travelers by connecting seamlessly airport operations, ground operators, but also hotels, mobility services, retailers in the airports, etc., to build an efficient ecosystem. And in this case, for example, the use case that has been implemented is about improving luggage management, ensuring fueling of planes, and better plan and manage resources for ground services. So these are very practical examples, and there are many others, of a technology that is being used in order to facilitate the sharing and exchange of data. I'd like to put a few words in my presentation also about regulations and standards and the role they practically play in accelerating the business. It's sometimes regulation are seen as a constraint, standards also may be sometimes considered as complex, but basically in this case, they are essential. And I'd like to link the notion of the regulations, reference architectures, and standards, and how they are playing and interacting and feeding each other in a critical way. So when we talk about regulation, there are many. GDPR, of course, but in various countries you have an equivalent of GDPR regulation, but we already mentioned the Data Governance Act and the Data Act, the A Act, and there are also other pieces of regulations. When we're talking about reference architecture, we're talking about all the work that is done by Gaia and DSSC and IDSA and other players, which are basically building some kind of de facto standards for data exchange. And you have the formal standards that are produced by standardization organization like W3C and Senelec, ISO, IEEE, NC, and others. And these are actually incredibly powerful lever to do a number of things. First of all, it's about building trust in data spaces and data ecosystem, but it also facilitates interoperability and also ensuring the highest level of security and privacy as well as sovereignty. These are keywords that are being very often and that are critical. If there's no trust, there will be no sharing or exchange of data. It's as simple as that. So you need to build trust. And by the way, data intermediaries are a key players that is bringing trust into the sharing and exchanging of data. And of course, the regulations that ensure that the intermediary plays the game fairly, I would say, by being neutral, by meeting various requirements, is also a trust-building element. Interoperability, the Data Act that was referred to also in previous presentation by Malte, is a lot about facilitating the access to data. And there's a specific chapter on interoperability between data spaces, and which are addressed and attached to a standardization, which is ongoing at the moment, which is called a trusted data transaction, which is currently done by Senelec, which is actually operationalizes the essential requirements that the Data Act is defining in terms of interoperability. I'd like to show now very quickly one example. It's just one example of how basically the Data Act and the Data Governance Act has an impact on the business aspect to organizations. There are some obligations related to the Data Act that the company who's a data holder of connected product data, IoT product, I would say, IoT-based products. They today, through the Data Act, they can be required to provide access to such data to the user of such connected product, or share those data to third parties. So that's an obligation that from the regulation. But there's also a number of opportunities that are related. The same company is also a potential user of connected products or related services, and therefore could be entitled to request data holders access to that data, or ask that that data is shared with the third party. The same company could be also one of those designated third party by the user of a connected product and act as a third party and therefore be entitled to get access to the data detained by the data holder. And last but not least, the same company could be, as a data intermediation services provider, should they be positioning themselves on that, they would be orchestrating an ecosystem of data providers that are placing connected products or related service on the EU market. And therefore, these participants to the ecosystem that they are orchestrating are actually required to comply to regulation. And by providing a data space environment, data ecosystems and services to facilitate those exchange and sharing of data, they can help and monetize in a certain way also the service of those companies participating so that they can comply with the regulations. So there's a number of obligations with the regulation, but also many opportunities. And to finalize my presentation, let's take just one example, a use case like an automotive service company that it could actually act as a trusted third party and also referring to the role of an intermediary that could facilitate data exchange. The challenge is the following in this example. Today, the richest diagnostic data are often captive within the car manufacturer ecosystem. They will reserve this data to their own network of dealership. And in this case today, before the Data Act actually, generally it's the dealership. If there's a problem with the car, there's an alert, the driver will bring the car to the dealership who will repairs the car. Now, with the Data Act, the driver can decide that they could actually use an automotive service company, not necessarily the dealership from the dealership where they bought the car, to actually say, I want this automotive service company who's providing very interesting services, that they have access to the data that I'm generating as a driver of a connected car, and therefore request the data to the car manufacturer, which is generally the data holder, that is compliant to provide that data. And the role of a data intermediation services and company could be that they can facilitate this process, and so that there's not only one-to-one relationship, but also a more optimized way of doing. So the data intermediation service provider is a key player in that case. And therefore, it's more competition, more innovation possible. In this case, what are the business benefits for this automotive service company here? They can actually provide high-value services. They have access to more data than the manufacturer itself, because they are generally multi-branded. They can provide high-value services to the driver and with better diagnosis. They can order parts before the customer arrives in the workshop. They can provide some predictive maintenance services. They can also increase, generally speaking, their customer loyalty through various services like vehicle health management services and so on, you name it. This is just one example. So these are very practical situations that actually links the regulations to real business. So as key takeaways, I would say that data space are operational across industries. You have data marketplace, industry data space, corporate data hubs that are moving way beyond pilots. That the data intermediation services are critical. They really can enable trusted, compliant, scalable data exchange between data holders and data users. Regulations and standards accelerate business adoption. So we name here the DGA and the Data Act, but also the standards I mentioned, like trusted data transaction. They create trust, legal certainty, and interoperability and scalability. Regarding technology that is supporting the sharing and exchange of data, it is critical that this technology that is being used, first of all, is completely necessary to use dedicated technology, but they must support multiple operational and business models. So because those ecosystems are so heterogeneous, with different requirements and requests, from decentralized to managed data exchanges, from supporting very large organizations and SMEs that may not necessarily be mature on all aspects regarding the governance of data exchanges. It's important that the technology can support those different types of scenarios. And also, and I will finish with this, the business aspects. Sustainable data space, they require business model agility. So basically, it's critical that the implementations that are being made and the governance and the business model, they are defined upfront before those projects start, actually, and they have to have the ability to evolve over time and without changing the underlying technology. That is critical, because you could start with a certain model. As I mentioned, 3 models like internal data space, data marketplace, and industry. These can evolve over time, and you don't want, as an organization, to review and change everything that is underlying from a technology perspective. It needs to adapt to these changes. And that will end up my presentation. Thank you very much.